change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So here we are. Jesus, he just comes down from the mountain after giving the greatest sermon ever recorded. And he just gets off that hillside and he's met by a leper. And as you read this, you see our gospel writer, Matthew, he writes chapter 8 as if it almost reads like this all happened in one day, that it's a day in the life of Jesus. But it probably wasn't, because Matthew's focus here is not so much of a timetable for these events. So it's not really in chronological order, because if you read the other synoptic gospels, most of these same events were already recorded in the Gospels of Mark, and they were also recorded in the Gospel of Luke. But what Matthew is dealing with here is a certain type of people that Jesus is healing. And the main people here that are coming to Jesus, they're all types of people that the Jewish rabbis hated. It was lepers. They hated Gentiles. They hated slaves, and they didn't really care for women. All these people were considered outcasts, especially by the Pharisees. And in those days, it was a pretty common prayer for a Pharisee to pray, I give thanks that I am a man, not a woman, a Jew and not a Gentile, and a free man and not a slave. And the greatest of all the outcasts here were the lepers, because they were not only outcasts from just the Pharisees, but they were the outcasts of all of Jewish society, because they were considered to be the outcasts of God. And although leprosy, it could be a whole different series of skin conditions, what the Bible calls leprosy is mostly what we know as Hansen's disease. And there's never been a cure for Hansen's disease, but today, that disease, it can be arrested so that it doesn't spread, and it's by the use of antibiotics. But leprosy is never cured. The last known leper colony in the United States was closed in 1969, and that was the Kalaupapa colony on the island of Molokai in Hawaii. And just like our country had leper colonies, the Jews had laws regarding where lepers could live, and they were all given in the Mosaic Law. Lepers, they had to dwell outside the camp or outside the city walls. And if a leper was to approach a person, they would always have to come from downwind because of the stench. And when the leper came to be about 150 feet away from a person, the leper was required to shout, unclean, unclean. So the leper, he would never come in contact with anyone else. And you have to realize that at the beginning of leprosy, it didn't really look so bad. But leprosy, it's a progressive disease. And over time, that leper would become grossly disfigured with large boils and tumors, where parts of their body would literally be rotting and falling off. But the first thing that leprosy does to a person is that it attacks the nervous system. It attacks your nerve trunks so that you lose feeling. And so you lose your feelings in your hands, and you lose your feelings in your feet. And so you wouldn't even know that you were going around and injuring yourselves. And so things like your hands and your feet, they would become infected, and you never even know it. And then your muscles, they'd start to waste away. And then your tendons, they would begin to contract, and your hands would begin to look like claws. And this is the reason that leprosy in the Bible has always been used to represent the effect of sin in one's life. Because what leprosy does to the body is what sin does to the inner person. Leprosy is equivalent to what sin does to the soul. Because sin, in the same way as leprosy, it desensitizes a person to the destruction that the sin is doing to them, where they can't see the effects of their sin. They can't feel the effects of their sin. And their inner man is rotting away and becoming more corrupt. And what you need to know is that in Israel, leprosy, it wasn't diagnosed by doctors. It was diagnosed by the priests. And when they would declare somebody to be unclean, which means leprous, that person was never able to see their family again. And it didn't matter if it was a little child or a young mother or a father or a widow. It didn't matter if it was your parents or your grandparents. That person never again would ever feel the touch of the ones that they loved. And they would never be able to touch anyone that they loved. That person was cut off immediately. For the sake of all, they had to live outside of society. Because just like sin, leprosy is very contagious. And so often the lepers, what they would do is they would live outside the city, outside the walls, in the garbage dumps. And they would live off the things that the people would throw away. They were considered to be the walking dead. And for all practical purposes to their families, they were considered to be dead, although they were still alive. And the minimum distance that a leper could be away from another human being was 6 feet. And that would be after giving all the warnings. They could only come within 6 feet of a person. And up until this time in Israel's history, there had only been 3 persons ever cleansed from leprosy. Leprosy is never called healed. It's always called cleansed. And the first person was Moses, and that was when God had revealed his power to Moses. God had Moses put his hand into his cloak and then to pull it out again. And it was leprous. It was white as snow. And then God told Moses to put it back again. And then when he pulled it out, it was restored. And the second person cleansed from leprosy was Miriam, Moses' sister, who rebelled against her little brother when they were in the wilderness. And so God gave her leprosy to teach her not to rebel. And after she repented and lived a few days outside of the camp, she was cleansed and allowed to come back in. And the third case of leprosy, for a person being cleansed, that would have been Naaman the Syrian, and he was a commander in the Syrian army. And he wasn't a Jew, he was a Gentile. And he came to faith because of a little Jewish servant girl who told him about a real prophet, the true prophet of the real God, and that he would be able to heal him of his leprosy. And so Naaman, he believed to the point where he actually traveled from Syria all the way to Israel to see this prophet. And God, he honored his faith and he healed him. And so now we have Jesus here, and he's coming down off the mountain, and he's greeted by this walking dead man, and he's full of leprosy. So this man, he has no hope in the world of his life ever being changed or ever being restored. But he's heard about Jesus healing people. And it may be possible that he may have just heard that Sermon on the Mount, maybe from a distance. But as he approaches Jesus, he breaks every Jewish protocol as he comes closer, and he worships him. And this leper, he already believes that Jesus is God because he calls Jesus Lord. And the word that he's using for Lord here is the Greek word kurios, which is the Greek translation of Yahweh. So this leper, he already believes that Jesus can heal him. His only question here is Jesus willing to heal me? Because the rabbis during this time, they hated lepers. Because the rabbis, they not only thought of leprosy as a comparison to sin, they believed that the lepers, that they were under a special type of judgment from God because of their sin. And that lepers, They didn't deserve mercy and they didn't deserve pity. And some of the rabbis, they even bragged about how badly they treated lepers. So they'd brag about throwing stones at them. And this leper, he knows all this. And so he's not sure that Jesus is going to receive him at all. So this leper's question isn't, can he heal me? But it's, is Jesus willing to heal me? And in the Mosaic law, it was prohibited for anyone to touch a leper, because if you touched a leper, it would make you unclean. And Jesus, he knows that he could have healed that leper without touching him. Because we see Jesus do this later when we get to like Luke 17, where he heals like 10 lepers without touching them. And we know that when Elisha, when he healed Naaman, the Syrian, he didn't touch him. And Moses, he didn't touch even Miriam when she was healed. So Jesus, he didn't have to touch him, but Jesus decided to touch him. And then you have to realize that this man wasn't dirty. This man was filthy dirty, and he smelled like something dead. But when Jesus touched him, it didn't make Jesus unclean. It made the leper clean. And then you have to realize that this is probably the first physical contact that this man has had with another human being in years. And it shows us the way that Jesus, how he loves this man and how he pities him and how he shows him mercy. And in the same way, Jesus pities each of us because he sees the leprosy in our souls where the sin has been destroying us for years, where we may not even know that we were being destroyed. But there's some of us, we know what we've done and what kind of sins we've committed, where when we think about them, we have a hard time even looking ourselves in the eyes. And then sometimes we can wonder, is Jesus willing to make me clean and to show me mercy? But Jesus, through this, he shows us through this demonstration by cleansing this leper that he's willing to cleanse us too, no matter what we've done. We could even be a walking dead man. We could be all consumed in our sin. But Jesus, that he is willing to make us clean. And all you have to do is what this poor leper did. You have to come and worship him. You have to come and confess Jesus as Lord, that he's God, he's Yahweh, and then you have to ask him to cleanse you. But you might not think your sins are so bad, but like leprosy, sin is a progressive disease, and you wouldn't be feeling how sin is destroying your life anymore. Where there's parts of you now that may be numb in areas where you used to be sensitive, but now those areas, they're falling off. And a lot of times we can't see it in ourselves, but we often can see it in other people, because we can usually see it like in drug addicts who can't for themselves see it happening in their lives, but we can see where their addictions have taken them with their years of abuse. And you can maybe see it in some alcoholics. You can see it in maybe the mentally ill people that are living homeless, that are walking streets, and they're just sitting around talking to themselves. Whatever sin that brought them to that point, and I'm not trying to judge people. I would be with them. Just give me 2 weeks without walking with the Lord, and I'd sit there like a crazy man walking the streets. But these things, these sins, they're spiritual leprosy, and Jesus can make them clean too. And it's never a question if he's willing, because Jesus, he's always willing, because that's what he came here to do. That's why Jesus came into the world. It's really a question if a person is willing to come to Jesus. But for most of us, we would have to be like this leprous man to come to Jesus, where we have no other hope after trying everything else. And so now Jesus, he sends him away, and he tells him not to tell anyone. He says, but go show yourself to the priest at the temple, and then to offer the appropriate offering that Moses commanded in the day of your cleansing. So now he goes off to the temple. But here is where you need to realize This is the first leper that Jesus ever cleansed. In fact, he's the first Jewish person that's ever cleansed from leprosy since the law was written, because Naaman, who Elisha cleansed, he wasn't a Jew. He was a Gentile. He was a Syrian. So now this leper, this Jewish leper, he shows up at the temple and he shows himself to the priest, because you had to show yourself to the priest for him to declare you clean. But that priest, he would have had to look up in the law of how to perform this specific offering, because it had never been done before. And even if it had been done for Miriam, for Moses' sister, it hadn't been performed for over 1,400 years. And so you can imagine this priest. He's never done this before, and he's never known anyone who has done this before. And then if you can remember way back when we were teaching in John, you remember that all these priests, well, they were all Sadducees. And Sadducees, they didn't believe in miracles. And so this guy, he's just the first of all these lepers that Jesus will be sending to the priest to testify to them that Jesus is the Messiah. And you kind of can get an idea of how this happened, because the same story of the leper that we just read, who was cleansed, we can read about him in the Gospel of Mark. And in Mark, we're told that he didn't obey Jesus. He didn't keep quiet, but he told everybody. And when he did this, he made it impossible for Jesus to go into the cities to minister. So people had to go outside the city to see Jesus. But because of this healing, all the lepers start coming to Jesus. And as often as they came, Jesus was cleansing them, and then he was sending them to the priests. And so you have this whole parade of cleansed lepers constantly flowing into the temple. And the priest, they were continually having to make the offering for a leper, this offering that they hadn't been performing for over 1,400 years. And what's really interesting is that when you read about the offering, and we won't read it, but we'll talk about it, but you can read that offering in Leviticus 14, and it consisted of 2 clean birds, some cedar wood and some scarlet and some hyssop. And so what would happen is they would take one of these birds, of the 2 birds, and it was to be killed, and it was to be killed over an earthen vessel. And that earthen vessel was to be held over running water. Okay, so that bird that's killed, well, in our minds as Christians, we'd say, well, that bird represented Jesus and his death. So that blood, it's collected in that earthen vessel. And earthen vessels were considered earthen vessels because earthen vessels are made of clay. We're made of clay. And so that represents Jesus becoming flesh and being held over the running water. Well, the running water, well, that's a type of the Holy Spirit. And then after you do this, you take that living bird, you take that second bird, and you dip that bird with some cedar wood and the scarlet and some hyssop, and you dip it in that earthen vessel of the blood of the sacrificed bird. And then what you do is you take that hyssop, which is a plant, which is like a sponge, and you sprinkle that 7 times on the leper, and then you pronounce him clean. But then what you do is you take the blood-covered bird, and then you let it go free and you let it fly away. And so what you have here is you have a picture of being set free by the blood of a substitute's sacrifice. And for us, that substitute is Jesus. And the thing is, it cleanses the leper from leprosy the same way as it cleanses the leprosy of our souls, because leprosy represents sin. And if I was going to take my very best guess, I would guess that Jesus' cross was made out of cedar wood. Okay, so now you have the priests. They're making this offering over and over and over for every leper that Jesus sends to them. And they should have known that this offering testifies of Jesus, especially when he was crucified. But they didn't. Somehow they missed it. Okay, so now Jesus, he leaves this leper and he's just about home, and he just enters into Capernaum. And then a centurion comes up to him. And what a centurion is he's He's a Roman officer who's over 100 men. And every centurion that's ever mentioned in the Bible is an honorable man. And this centurion was no exception, because this centurion, he cared about his slave who had become paralyzed and he was in torment. So that he has a slave that's in pain and he's paralyzed. And as a Roman master, he had the right to kill his slave. And that's exactly what everybody expected him to do, because this would be like having a broken tool. This would be like your tractor, his engine seized up, so he's no good anymore. But instead, this Roman soldier, he cares about this slave, even though the slave is no use to him anymore. But instead of just accepting his loss and discarding him, he shows this love for him, and he pities him, and he considers his life, because this slave, he's become like a part of the family to this Roman soldier. And we have to remember that there's just as many Gentiles up there in Capernaum as there was Jews in the Galilee area. And many of them were Romans, because if you remember, there's a Roman garrison that's outside of Nazareth, and then there's the Via Maris, which is the international trade route that ran through the Galilee. And even though that Jesus, he came to the Jews, all these Gentiles, they got to hear and they got to see Jesus too. And even though Jesus, he was on his way home, he was still willing to delay his homecoming to go to this non-Jewish Gentile Roman's house and to lay his hands on his slave to heal him. Now, most Jews, especially the religious Jews, well, they hated the Gentiles, and they especially hated the Romans, because it was the Romans who were oppressing Israel. But this Roman centurion, the Jews, they didn't hate him so much, because you'll read in Mark's gospel that this centurion, he's the one who built the Jews a synagogue. And if you went to Capernaum today, you would still see the stones from this actual synagogue that was built by this centurion. And so you figure this centurion, he probably lives somewhere in the area. He's not real far away. But a Jew, he would never enter a Gentile's house because of Jewish tradition. Because the Jews were taught that to enter a Gentile's house, that would make a Jew unclean. But this was never a part of God's law. It was just a part of the Jewish tradition. But Jesus, again, he's here and he's willing to go to this Gentile's house and to lay his hands on his slave and to heal him. And Jesus, he knew that he could heal that centurion servant from where he was. And he knew he could do it with just a word. But he wasn't aware that the centurion knew that Jesus had that type of authority to be able to heal his servant without him being physically present. So you can see that God has already been doing a great work in the centurion's heart, and how God has already revealed to him who Jesus really is and the kind of authority that Jesus really had. And he's basing it all on his own authority of what he's been taught. And so the centurion, he says that he doesn't need to come. In fact, he's not really even worthy for him to come into his house, under his roof. But that Jesus, he just needs to speak the word. And so it almost seems like the centurion is looking for a way to spare Jesus from being criticized from going into a Gentile's home. And he's also aware and trying not to inconvenience Jesus from taking up too much of his time. And this is one of the only 2 times where it says that Jesus marveled. And here it says, Jesus marveled at this man's great faith. And he said that he didn't even see this kind of faith among any of the Jews.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel Waterford and Your Neighborhood Church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,